Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. This is your host, Aminah Ahmed, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. Welcome back to another episode of NextGen, where we seek to amplify the voices of young people. You're watching us live on Facebook and YouTube, and you're watching us on Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and Galaxy 19 satellite. Last week, we saw Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the United States receiving a warm welcome from many members of our community, many citizens of this country. And it raises the question of what does Hindu nationalism mean for Muslims in America and for people who live in America and enjoy the democracy and the freedom and the liberties that we receive in this country. So with me today, I have a young Muslim woman, Safa Ahmed, the Associate Director of Media and Communications for the Indian American Muslim Council, the largest and the oldest diaspora organization aimed at combating Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, and promoting democratic values in both India and the US. She has written on Hindutva for Al Jazeera, Progressive Magazine, and many other outlets. Safa, it is an honor to be here with you today, but I want to know the answer to that question. What implications does this have? I mean, we saw the way that Prime Minister Narendra Modi was welcomed last week. What does this mean for Americans? What does this mean for those of us who love democracy, who don't want to see fascism rise in our country or in others? What is the implication of this?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Aminah. To your question, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is essentially a figurehead for the Hindu nationalist movement, as you mentioned, also referred to as Hindu supremacy. And just for the uninitiated, Hindu supremacy, we use that term very deliberately because Hindu nationalism is, in essence, a Hindu supremacist movement that holds that India should not be a secular democracy and it should not pay any attention to the rights of religious minorities and instead be an ethno-state for Hindus, similar to the way Nazi Germany and other European fascist movements framed themselves as being aimed at creating ethno-states for a particular race or religious group. And so the implications, go ahead. So the implications of what's happening in India really does have a ripple effect on what happens to the Indian American diaspora and by extension to Indian American Muslims, but also to Muslims as a whole. So Hindu supremacy often allies very closely with movements such as white supremacy and Zionism. And the reason is because not only are they aimed at platforming the supremacy of one group over others, it's that they share this common goal of eradicating minorities who very much so happen to be Muslim in their respective countries. So you'll look at rhetoric of white supremacy where there are claims that Muslims are invaders, they're terrorists, etc. You know, all the tired stereotypes. Hindutva relies on the exact same stereotypes and tropes to say that Muslims do not belong in India, that Muslims are the descendants of invaders, that Muslims have never contributed anything to India, that Muslims are inherently violent, etc., etc. And so you see Hindu supremacist propaganda really making the rounds in white supremacist spaces in the United States. And you mentioned, like, what are the consequences for American democracy? I think a lot of people are under the impression that Hindu supremacy only impacts Muslims in India or minorities in India. And the reality is that Hindu supremacy has been impacting Muslims and particularly Indian American Muslims for a very, very long time. And that's kind of why IMC, our organization, put forth this survey earlier in the spring to take a look at how Hindu supremacy impacts Indian American Muslims and gauge the way that they're feeling isolated, targeted, harassed, et cetera, et cetera. These are issues that have been kind of in the quiet for a bit too long now, but we're seeing with the welcome that Modi received, and we're seeing with the way American politicians are increasingly beginning to call out India and its role in repressing American citizens and its role in amplifying certain supremacist ideals, that this problem is coming more and more out into the open.
Sure. And you're talking about this survey, and it shows how this impacts Indian Muslims. How have Indian Muslims responded to this? How have Indian Muslims responded to the rise of Hindutva, not only in their home country, where they perhaps some of their family have to face that back home, but also in America? What does that look like? What does that response look like?
Sure. So this survey, as I mentioned, was conducted earlier this year. And we did a survey of our community. So generally speaking, this was not a random sample. This was more so talking to people who are aware of Hindutva, who know what's going on in India in terms of politics, etc. But the findings are pretty alarming. And from that, we gather that there are a non-insignificant number of Indian American Muslims who face discrimination from their Hindu colleagues who might happen to hold Hindu supremacist values or beliefs. So some of the statistics I can walk you through very quickly. 80% of respondents stated that they feel less comfortable in Indian American cultural spaces since the rise of India's Bharatiya Janata Party, which is abbreviated as the BJP. And this is Modi's far-right political party. And it's important to note that not a single respondent noted feeling more comfortable since the BJP came to power in 2014. They've now ruled for almost a decade. And in that time, as some of your viewers might know, anti-minority violence, hate speech, calls for genocide have only escalated more and more as the years have gone on, to the point where some experts are saying that India may be on the cusp of the ethnic cleansing of its Muslim minority. So our respondents not only were aware of that, around 94% of the respondents strongly agreed that Hindu nationalism poses a threat to religious minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians in India. But 86% of respondents also saw Hindu nationalism as a threat to democracy in the United States. And they cited very particular reasons why. So they said that Hindu nationalist ideology does tend to rear its head in US politics, in academia, and I can give more concrete examples of that later on. But they also noted just experiencing in general that sometimes their friends, their social contacts, their colleagues at work who happen to be Hindu, some of them are starting to act more discriminatory towards them. So 81% of respondents reported experiencing some form of harassment, discrimination, or prejudice from Hindu friends or social contacts in the past decade, and 70% reported experiencing similar treatment from Hindu colleagues at work. And this type of experience ranged from social exclusion to direct harassment. And what that tells us, at least in the Indian American Muslim community, there is this very distinct problem of Hindu nationalist ideas, of this idea that Narendra Modi is a great thing to happen to India. That comes with its own baggage, where some people are starting to see Muslims as less than Indian, as less than human. And if you talk to, our parents' generation, the immigrant generation, who came to this country after spending decades in India, a lot of them will echo the same thing anecdotally. They'll say things like, we used to have a lot of Hindu friends. We used to enjoy holidays together. It wasn't a big deal to interact in each other's social circles. And the fact that there are so many people noticing, hey, there's something a little bit off about these same people who we grew up with. There's something off about the Indian American social and cultural spaces in general is alarming. And so we at IAMC are using the survey as a chance to take forward the conversation about Hindu nationalism in the United States, or Hindu supremacy, and talk about what are the material implications of this supremacist ideology spreading amongst a minority community and attacking another minority community. And this is one more thing I'll add, is that this survey is the first of its kind, but it certainly will not be the last. This is the beginning of a longer conversation. There absolutely needs to be more research done into the way Hindu supremacy impacts Indian American Muslims. And to that point, there needs to be a lot more awareness within the Muslim community. This needs to be a wake-up call for the broader Muslim community, not just the Indian American Muslims, but the Arab Muslims, the African Muslims, Asian Muslims, all across the spectrum. of Muslim identity, Hindu supremacy doesn't discriminate, no matter what type of Muslim you are. It hates Muslims equally, unfortunately, and that's why it is so important for us as a community to be aware of it and its dangers. If I heard correctly, I'm sorry, I'm having problems a little bit, but I heard like, how do we take action? Is that correct?
And Safa, now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Is it much better now? Okay.
Better.
Is it better now?
Yes, perfect. Okay, now it's on mute again.
How is it now?
Great.
Is it a little bit better now?
Yes, it's perfect now.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do that part again so the part where you spoke of the impact on Indian Muslims, we're just going to review that again. And then I will ask that question one more time so that you can hear it a little better and our audience can hear it a little bit better. Is that okay?
Sure. Sounds great.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Safa, for sharing your experience and your understanding of what it means to be an Indian Muslim in America and abroad, dealing with the rise of Hindu nationalism, the rise of Hindutva. But when it comes to American politics, how does the rise of Hindu nationalism impact our democracy, impact our politics at home? I mean, we hear about this. There's been so much talk about the influence of Hindutva on American politics and especially on American politicians. But how do we see this in action?
Sure. So I talked a little bit about Hindu supremacy or Hindu nationalism and its kind of roots in this World War II era ideologies of fascism. And so you see this playing out in American politics in the form of allying with other supremacist groups or other groups that are rooted in the same type of fascist ideology or love for fascism, such as Zionism, such as white supremacy. And often you'll notice that the way that Hindu supremacists bond with these people is by professing their shared hatred of Muslims and their hatred of Islam, this view of Islam as this cancer upon the earth that needs to be eradicated. And they're quite explicit about that. And so how this plays out materially is that you'll often see Hindu supremacists acting upon those alliances in ways that also benefit white supremacists. So in some ways, yes, they will carry water for the BJP. At home, they will lobby on behalf of BJP adjacent or BJP ideologically adjacent politics. They will ask the US government or the American people not to care about Indian issues that impact minorities, such as the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was a discriminatory law that was passed in India that was aimed at stripping citizenship from Muslims en masse. And there are lobby groups and Hindu supremacist groups in the United States who are actively working to, cut all criticism of those acts. But even more broadly speaking, as I mentioned, they do tend to collaborate with white supremacists and Zionists on issues that those two other movements care deeply about. So we have seen a lot of Hindu supremacists in India and in the US carrying water for Israel or manufacturing consent for the genocide of Palestinians. You'll also see that white supremacist causes such as affirmative action and wanting to overturn that were very enthusiastically picked up by certain members of Hindu supremacist groups in the United States. And they would talk about things like how, we want admissions based on merit, et cetera, talking about things like critical race theory and kind of editing that to fit their own ideology, such as through the form of this, what they call critical caste theory, and demanding that not be taught in schools, demanding that the history of caste oppression and caste-based discrimination not be taught in schools. In California, that was a big example of one time where Hindu supremacist groups attempted to cut mention of caste from school textbooks in California. And these battles continue to play out across the United States. You'll see Hindu supremacists who were very vehemently opposed to legislation in California that would protect caste-oppressed communities from caste-based discrimination in Silicon Valley. So throughout California, in Seattle, and then there's the discrimination of Muslims, the attempt to smear Muslim politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. You'll see these concentrated attempts to smear Muslim advocacy groups such as CARE and Indian American Muslim Council as these terror-affiliated groups. And this is a slander and a smear as old as, 9/11 itself. These are very tired tropes, but they whip them out repeatedly. They will talk about Indian Muslims and tie it to white supremacist and Zionist ideas of what this Muslim terrorist figure is like, and they will say things like Muslims are ethnically cleansing Hindus, etc., etc. They will say things like Hindus are in danger in India because of Muslims, again calling upon this idea of the fragile dominant group that is threatened by this tiny minority. It never holds water or never holds up to scrutiny. But these groups depend on these mythologies of what is this scary Muslim person going to do to our amazing, glorious group, amazing, glorious history, And so we see these collaborations. One I can very definitively point to is that Hindu supremacist groups in the United States, specifically the Vish Hindu Parishad of America, which is the American wing of an active Hindu militant group in the United States. And when I say Hindu militant group, I do mean they are actively carrying out anti-Muslim violence in India. And their members have been implicated in countless massacres, in mob lynchings, in cow vigilantism, etc. So their American wing has worked with groups like the Middle East Forum. And anyone who is even marginally aware of how Islamophobia and the Islamophobia industry works will know that the Middle East Forum makes its money off of demonizing Muslims. And you have figures like Robert Spencer, who is a very prominent Islamophobe who had a very active audience once, particularly after 9/11, who is now trying to rekindle his following and his popularity by reaching out to an Indian audience, appealing to them, saying the things that they want to hear, demonizing Muslims in a way that they can relate to. So these supremacist movements are all deeply interconnected. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into how they're playing out in American politics. Yes, lobbying against civil rights protections and demonizing Muslim civil rights groups is a big one. But there's also this concerted effort to appeal to the American right wing, politically speaking. So Steve Bannon, everyone knows who Steve Bannon is, was the co-chair of the Republican Hindu Coalition, I believe, could be, the exact name escapes me, but Steve Bannon has been involved with Republican Hindu supremacists. There is space growing on the right for the Hindu supremacist movement, and there is an effort from these people, from these groups, to push Indian Americans rightward on the political spectrum, even though in the past they've been a fairly reliably progressive or liberal vote base. So in that sense, yes, there is something to be concerned about. There is this acceptance of far-right politics and all the baggage it carries with it. And we often think, okay, well, a minority group can't possibly join the far right because in the United States, the far right hates brown people, Black people, etc. But what we see more and more these days is the rise of a multiracial far right that is using diversity to create power in the United States. And Hindu supremacy plays a big role in that.
And Safa, you draw these parallels between Hindu nationalism, between white supremacy, between Zionism, and it seems that more people are aware of the latter two rather than the former. And I'm curious to know, why is it that people see these other forces, these other right-wing forces as a huge problem, which is obviously, it is obviously substantiated, but why is that not the case with Hindu nationalism? Why is it so that Hindu nationalism is so often brushed under the rug or seen as a problem that is only relevant to back home? Clearly, from all that you have said today and all that your work speaks for, is that Hindu nationalism is a problem today in America. Why is it that that is not put out in the media or put out in the public?
So this is kind of a twofold answer, but I'm going to start by addressing your question as to why people think this is a back home problem. The simple answer is that there has not been enough front-facing advocacy work that combats Hindu supremacy to its face. I mean, there is work being done There's a lot of work being done, but it hasn't yet hit the point where this is so mainstream that all the major civil rights groups and liberal spaces in the United States are talking about it. And when it hits those spaces, that's when you know, like, okay, this is really going mainstream. The awareness is going mainstream. Unfortunately, that has not yet happened. And the reason, or part of the reason why, is because there are Hindu nationalist groups who hold the same politics related to India as do the VHPA, which I just mentioned is the American wing of a Hindu militant group in India. But these groups that situate themselves in liberal or maybe even progressive spaces in the United States don't often show themselves as right-wing groups. They like to use their minority identity in order to couch their politics in the language of anti-racism and social justice. So they'll say things like, we talk about Hindu rights in India, or even like Hindu rights in the United States, or they'll say we speak for all Hindus, when in reality, what they're doing is pushing a Hindu supremacist narrative or a Hindu supremacist understanding of India and understanding of the Indian American diaspora, and what beneficial policies to Hindus and Indian Americans look like through that very supremacist lens that actively seeks the erasure of Muslims, of Dalits, of Indian Christians, etc. And so these groups are often hard for, generally speaking, the American public or American liberals or progressives to even identify in the first place, because often, as any good activist should do, obviously there's due diligence involved, but a lot of times people will think to themselves like, okay, I don't know enough about the politics of this minority group. I don't know enough about, the problems that might be between two existing groups, and I'm just not going to, get into that. I'm not going to touch that. And unfortunately, these groups, these Hindu supremacist groups, have really capitalized off of that ignorance. And they've used it to push their discourse and push their ideas of what India should look like, and how the Indian American diaspora should be treated. And that's part of, again, like I said, that's part of the reason why the issue of Hindu supremacy is still not mainstream yet, even though it's a very old movement. It is at least 100 years old, or a little bit less than 100 years old. And the fact that it hasn't yet been exposed, broadly speaking, to the American public is really due to the fact that a lot of people just don't know what's happening in India. It's really not on the top of people's minds. India is an ally country. India is still seen as the world's largest democracy. India has a lot of soft power. If you approach the average American on the street, they're not going to really know Modi. They're not going to know what's happening in India, aside from they'll be like, oh, I know yoga, I know Bollywood, etc. Those types of things. And so it's really on activists and people who are aware of the issue to talk about it, to raise awareness about it in the same way that people raised awareness about Palestine and Zionism. It's really important for the Indian American Muslim community, yes, to speak about it, but also the broader Muslim community, because as I just said, Zionism doesn't, Hindutva doesn't discriminate in the type of Muslim that it hates. Of course, it targets the Indian Muslim first and foremost, but it also hates Pakistani Muslims, it hates Bangladeshi Muslims. By extension, it hates Palestinians, Arabs, Somalis, Sudanese Muslims, etc. And so it becomes important for the American Muslim community at large to say, hey, Hindutva is an issue that we're raising as a group to our representatives and saying this harms us as a whole, and we need there to be active work to be done to combat it. We need to reach out to people in not just policy spaces, but also in these advocacy spaces and say, hey, Hindu supremacy and Hindu nationalism, they do tend to infiltrate in these spaces sometimes. And we need it to be called out wherever it might be. There is no space for soft supremacy anywhere in politics that seek to involve minorities or seek to amplify Muslim rights.
Right. And Safa, there is a very clear stance here that we have to raise awareness about what is going on. The activists, the advocates in our communities need to do that. But how is it that a young person who might not be so educated about these topics, who might not be so aware about what is going on in India, how can they first educate themselves enough so that they can go out and talk about it and raise awareness? And secondly, how can they be that kind of beacon of light in our community that shares the information about what is happening back home to our brothers and sisters back home in India, to the Christians and the Dalits, but also is standing up for justice here in America? How can we kind of, I guess, train these young people to do that? And I know there are young people watching us today that might look up to the work that you are doing. What can they do to get involved?
I think first and foremost, I would do a plug and direct them to the Indian American Muslim Council website, which is iamc.com. And there you'll find our FAQ section, which talks in detail about what Hindu supremacy is, how it originated, what are the common myths of Hindu supremacy, and how is it impacting Indian American Muslims, but also how it's impacting minorities in India across the spectrum, whether they're Muslim, Sikh, or Christian, or Dalit. So that's one place to get started. I would also really strongly recommend one of our coalition partners' websites, which is Hindus for Human Rights. And you can find them on Instagram or just on their website. You'll find that they do a lot of explainers from a Hindu perspective of why Hindu supremacy is not Hinduism, of how young people can, talk about these issues. Maybe if they have Hindu friends whose parents might be in that BJP Modi orbit, how do you talk to them about Hindu supremacy and how it's impacting young Muslims or just Muslims in general? And lastly, I would say follow these organizations on Twitter, follow Indian activists on Twitter. They do a lot of work to raise awareness about how Hindu supremacy impacts Indian minorities. For those of you who are willing to see hate crimes that are being documented, and I will warn that some of these videos can be disturbing to watch, but Hindutva Watch is a great resource to follow if you want to see the extent of anti-Muslim hate crimes in India. There are a lot of other activists and journalists in India. I would recommend searching up Muslim journalists like Muhammad Zubair and others, activists like Afreen Fatima, Sharjeel Usmani, etc. These types of people are amazing resources who do keep their fingers on the pulse of what is happening to Muslims in India. And I would say also to my brothers and sisters who are, younger and who are excited to get involved, I say, do whatever you can to learn. Really try to absorb the information, and then let's try to do what our Palestinian brothers and sisters have done and make this cause something that everyone in the Ummah can get behind. Everyone in the Ummah can understand Zionism. And I think it is so important to point out that Hindutva actively enables Zionism. And it is an equal, don't want to compare threats, but it is very extremely important for us to identify these threats so that we can say as one voice that these problems, these Muslims who are suffering, they're all worthy of attention. These are causes that Indian Muslims need to bring forward first. So that's where I would bring my call to action, is for young Indian American Muslims to really do your research, really understand the issue. If there are myths that you come across, if there are Hindu supremacist propaganda talking points, I would say check them against the IMC website or the Hindus for Human Rights websites. There is a lot of information out there actively combating it. South Asia Scholar Activist Collective is another really good one, where they have a Hindutva harassment field manual, where it talks about the myths of Hindu supremacy and what do you do if you've been harassed by Hindu supremacists, whether that's on campus or in an activism setting. So yeah, just overall, the call here is for young Muslims to be educated, and from there to talk about it, post about it, say whatever you have to say about it. Because one thing I will say, the BJP propaganda machine never sleeps. And so the only combat to a whole pile of lies is the truth. And that is exactly what we have on our side here.
Safa, you are truly an inspiration for the next generation, for this generation. Honestly, the work that you are doing with so much determination and passion is inspiring, truly inspiring. Thank you for being on our show. Thank you for the work that you are doing for Indian Muslims in America and for Indian Muslims back home. You are phenomenal.
Thank you so much, and likewise.
Thank you, Safa. It was such an honor to have you on our show. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in to NextGen. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV, Galaxy 19 Satellite, Roku, and Facebook and YouTube Live. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all.